With this lesson, we're going to be focusing on some common themes and some writers with sort of some common backgrounds. We're going to be looking at culture and identity, and we're going to be examining the works of Maxine Hong Kingston and Amy Tan. Both of these are first generation, well, second generation, I should say, second generation immigrants from Asia. And they have a lot in common, and they're also very different from one another. The idea here is just to kind of sample a work by each of these writers, especially in the 20th century, and see what we see. I think this, especially as we get into the latter part of the 20th century, some of the things that you'll see in some of these writers might strike home a little bit more with you because they're a little bit more modern. I'm going to look first at Maxine Hong Kingston's On Discovery. Both of these works that we're going to be looking at by Kingston and by Tan are excerpts from larger works. Okay, so this particular piece called On Discovery is from a text called China Men, which came out in 1980. Woman Warrior is another one of her famous pieces, and she's published many others. She's received an award from the president. I've forgotten what the name of it was, but she received that not too long ago. She's about 75 years old, and she writes about a lot of different sorts of issues, not just issues related to herself and her background, but in particular what's interesting is the dynamic that's set up here with this writer and with the next one about the generations and the differences between the generations, particularly of immigrant families, I should say. Chinamen is an interesting book because it's a real mix of different kinds of writings. It's got a lot of myth and storytelling and folklore and folk tales and things in it, but it's also got some true to life narrative, okay, historical narrative, biographical, autobiographical sorts of stuff all mixed in. It's all a mixture. And I think one of the reasons why Kingston does that is because she's trying to make a statement about how our lives are made up of different kinds of stories, okay, stories that are based in what we would call reality, but stories that, you know, sort of influence our lives and our upbringing. Think about how important sort of some of the childhood stories that you experienced, maybe it was like Dr. Seuss or something like that, and how important that was to you, or fables or folk tales, or maybe some family stories that you grew up with. And Kingston's kind of interested in how, you know, true stories, but also myths and legends and folklores, you know, kind of formulate or help form who we are. Now, interesting here, now this is an excerpt from the book, okay, and it's not designed to be really read kind of all by itself in isolation. But one thing you can see here is that there's a sort of tripartite structure to this excerpt. The first, there's the myth, okay, then there's a very, very brief piece that you think is, well, that's just an extra paragraph, but notice that it's divided, okay? There are breaks here in the text. So there's another little piece, and then there's a little bit longer piece, which seems to be either biographical or autobiographical. We can assume, I think, that it's autobiographical. I haven't read on whether Kingston's ever commented on whether it's autobiographical, but so much of the work is autobiographical that you might think that it's probably about her life as well. You know, regardless of all of that, what we want to ask are some interesting questions. The first question I want us to think about is, what is the point of the myth, which is the first part? What is its relationship or relation to the second smaller section and what's in it? And then a really hard question, because you're going to say, what? I just don't see it. What's the relation between the first section and the third section? Okay, so we're going to take a quick look at it. Tang Ao is the man who stumbles across the land of the women, right? And he thinks he's gotten lucky. He thinks, this is my lucky day. I'm going to now go and live in the land of the women, and it's going to be fantastic because I'll have all of these different women to sort of cater to my wishes, or you know, I'll be the only guy, and it'll be wonderful, and they'll all think I'm terrific, etc. And he finds out quite to the contrary, that he is essentially treated like a second-class citizen, a servant. He is displayed, he is made over, and all of those kinds of things. And of course, I mean, it's in some sense, it's a fairly obvious sort of point that she's making here, I would think, okay, and that is, you know, this is what happens when one is in a culture and one does not have the power, right? So in a male-dominated culture, men have power, women are objectified, they're subservient, they're you know, they're prized for their looks and all that sort of stuff, and they're told to be obedient to men and their desires, and they're kind of primped and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's a kind of a feminist aspect to this, but there's another aspect that, quite apart from that, is just if you're different, right? Whether it's gender or not, if you're different, you see, from the group that might be calling the shots in a given society, in this case women, then you're seen differently, right? And it's a different kind of scenario. So she's exploring kind of both of these without trying to be too preachy, but it's a pretty obvious scenario. They forced him to wash his used bandages, which were embroidered with flowers and smelled of rotten cheese. What types of bandages? The foot binding bandage. If you know anything about foot binding, go ahead and Google it. Be careful what you look at, because it's really, really gross. I provided a picture down there on the bottom of traditional Chinese foot binding. This was done largely with upper class women, and the idea was to sort of diminutize their feet, because this was seen as a sign of beauty, and also it kept them from walking much, as you can imagine, because one of the things that they wanted to do is to have upper class women be weighted on hand and foot and not have to walk, or to be, it was just seen as a sign of beauty. It looks freakishly weird to me, but unless you've got a strong stomach, don't take a look at pictures on how they do this, okay? But in the myth portion of this, you can see that, you know, they talk quite it's an agonizing and weird process that one goes through. They plucked out each hair of his face, powdered him white, painted his eyebrows like a moth's wings, painted his cheeks and lips red. He served a meal at the queen's court. His hips swayed and his shoulders swiveled because of his shaped feet. She's pretty, don't you agree? Notice they take away even his male pronoun, okay? The diners said, smacking their lips at his dainty feet as he bent to put dishes before them. And that's the end of the story, right? That's the end of the story. Then we get the second section, and the second section simply reads like this. In the women's land, there are no taxes and no wars. Some scholars say that that country was discovered during the reign of Empress Wu, A.D. 694 to 705, and some say earlier than that, A.D. 441, and it was in North America. End of section. Okay, so it's an interesting question. Why drop that in there, right? I thought that we were done with the story. Okay, this is the land of the women over here, and the women's land. I assume they're the same thing, right? She tries to offer sort of a historical nugget. So 1, myth. 2, piece of something that sounds like it's out of a history text. I'm unaware of any land of the women or women's land or anything like that actually existing in history. But maybe, I don't know. There were obviously some matriarchal societies, but nothing like what we were just read in the first section, correct? But notice what it says. It says, there were no taxes and no wars, okay? No taxes and no wars. Those are two kind of not so great things about governments, right? They tax you and then they, you know, they go to war with each other. So it's a kind of an idyllic sort of thing, isn't it? But is it? Because the first half, if you think it's critical of men, it's equally critical of women, right? So you say, oh, well, if governments were just run by women, we wouldn't have taxes, we wouldn't have wars, no one would be mistreated. Oh, wait a minute. The story actually has women mistreating men, so maybe it's not really about men. Maybe it's about how people in positions of power or dominance take advantage of that. And it's an interesting kind of thing if you look at it. But here's the interesting question. The third part, which is seemingly autobiographical, goes into an interesting piece about the differences between generations and immigrants, okay? And she talks about she may have been unusually beloved, the precious only daughter, spoiled and mirror-gazing because of the affection the family lavished on her. When her husband left, they welcomed the chance to bring her back from the in-laws. She could live with them like a little daughter for just a little while longer. There are stories that my grandmother was different from other people. Crazy. A grandfather was different. Crazy. Everything. So it would appear that this daughter goes and gets married, but then her husband leaves her, but the family welcomes her back because she was the only daughter and they like to spoil her and make a big deal out of her, okay? So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, at first you think, well, it must be a good thing because that's nice. Everybody likes to be spoiled, right, and made over. But remember what happened to our gentleman Tang Ao in the first? He thought he had a great thing, but actually no, right? Actually it was very confining and restricting and not so great, okay? They all admired his beauty and made a big deal out of him, they bound his feet, you see. So it's an interesting sort of thing. Her grandfather even went and traded his son to go find a girl, because he really wanted. Grandfather was kind of a nutty guy. Anybody who does what he did with, well, we won't go there. You read the story. That's just a little bit on the odd side. Everybody has a strange person in their family, but I don't think I've ever had, anyway. The immigrant sign, and here's an interesting thing. The next paragraph, it seems like this thing is totally disjointed and has nothing to do with each part, but it does. It does. Look for the webbing in between. Look for the thing that ties it together. The last paragraph, she says, the immigrants I know have loud voices, unmodulated to American tones, even after years away from the village where they called their friendships out across the fields. Okay? She's kind of a little bit, as a second-generation American, she's like, I'm kind of embarrassed by my family. They yell a lot, They're really loud. Hey, guys, can you tone it down? And toning it down is kind of a real American thing in a lot of households. My wife's family is from Spain and Puerto Rico, and if you want to see, 5 people lead 6 different conversations at the same time, then you should go to Spain and hear that. I mean, it's just people are constantly talking over each other, and I'm just like, what and why are you all so loud? But it's just raucous, and it's just the way they are. And there's something about Americans, I don't know what it is, but at home we tend to be fairly quiet, and when we go overseas, good heavens, we're loud in public. I don't know what it is. But she's remarking on this difference, and she's a little bit embarrassed by it. My immigrant families that I know, gosh, they're a little bit kind of, they're not quite American enough, you see. And so as a child of immigrant parents, but someone who's been raised thoroughly in the United States, she has this kind of, love but also embarrassment relationship with her family and the people from her country of origin. I have not been able to stop my mother's screams in public libraries or over telephones. Right, Amy, right? You can, Maxine. Sorry, different story. Maxine, you can hear her yelling, right? Walking erect, knees straight, toes pointed forward, not pigeon-toed, which is Chinese feminine. Now that's an interesting observation. And speaking in an inaudible voice. I have tried to turn myself American feminine. Chinese communication was loud, public. Only sick people had to whisper, right? So as a young woman, she says, my mother behaved in a feminine way, which was very much part of the older culture and the older country of China. I'm American, and so I've tried my best to kind of be American feminine, whatever that is, right? Because that's an interesting question, too. What is American feminine? And she's raising this question of whether femininity is kind of culturally dependent. If you don't think so, travel a bit and see how unbelievably different masculinity and femininity is from country to country to country. I mean, there's some commonalities, yes, but it's quite amazing how different femininity or masculinity is expressed in different sorts of cultures. For example, in Southern Europe or in Latin America, for example, women are very, very proud of their femininity. In Northern Europe, and okay, forgive the gross generalization. I mean, you go to Denmark and you go to, Germany or what have you, and the big criticism that I hear a lot of students, especially from Latin countries or from Southern Europe, say is, why are the women in Germany and Denmark so man-like, right? And I'm sure that women in Northern Germany look at Latino women or Southern European and say, oh my gosh, do they have to be so, flamboyantly feminine, right? Why do they walk like that? It's just very different. And so here she is trying to deal with this question of, what is my femininity? How is it expressed? How do I express it in the culture that I am living in, but not alienate or lose track of how that is expressed among my family? And then there's this bigger question of, well, what is femininity anyway? And should I want to hang on to that, given the fact that, we live in a patriarchal sort of society, and women frequently, at least at the time when she wrote this, certainly some 35 years ago, were treated very differently from men, and in some ways not so great, not so equal, right? So it's a really interesting story. But she ends with this. This was very interesting here. It doesn't have anything really to do so much with femininity. She says, only sick people had to whisper, but at the dinner table where the family members came nearest one another, no one could talk, not the outcasts nor any eaters. every word that falls from the mouth is a coin lost. In other words, at the dinner table, everyone's silent and everyone's careful with their food. Look, you don't even handle bowls with only one hand. Food is not a thing that is handled casually. Food is not a thing that one talks through. Food is not something that one just kind of, eats while you're doing something else. It's a thing one focuses on, and you demonstrate great care in handling it, and you concentrate on eating, right? Silently, they gave and accepted food with both hands. A preoccupied child who took his bowl with one hand got a sideways glare. Why is that? Well, I think part of it can be explained by the fact that, especially in the earlier part of the 20th century, many Chinese people endured enormous amounts of famine because of the political turmoil and a lot of things that were going all the way up through Mao and all that. And so starvation and famine and hunger was a huge thing with that generation. But now, so Maxine comes to this, she is born in this country. She's from this country. And she says, I don't get that, right? I don't get that. I never hungered. I never had to do without. But the parents and the grandparents still make you treat food very reverently, and you still have to concentrate, and you don't waste, and you don't handle it sort of clumsily, and you don't talk while we eat, and you don't, on all those things you say, I don't understand that. Why would you still do that? We live in America now. There's plenty of food. We don't have to worry about that. But again, the legacy of that from prior generations is part of her identity, and she's trying to struggle with that. So there's a lot to take in with this story, even though you say it doesn't have anything to do, the different parts don't have anything. Yes, they do. They have very much to do with one another.